Some cities swallow secrets whole. Others let them float just beneath the surface, visible but untouchable, like bodies in warm water. Miami Beach in 1993 was a city in transformation. The Art Deco district was being reborn in pastel and neon. Models and photographers claimed the streets. Tourists arrived in waves, drawn by the promise of endless summer. But beneath the renovation and the glamour, the old Miami Beach remained. The one that remembered when things were quieter, when people knew how to look away. This is a story about silence, about what happens when an entire community decides, without ever saying so aloud, that some questions are better left unasked. About a woman who disappeared on a Tuesday afternoon, and how 30 years would pass before anyone dared to speak her name in connection with the truth. Her name was Catherine Wells. She was 28 years old. She worked at a small art gallery on Lincoln Road, a street that was just beginning its long climb back from decades of neglect. She lived alone in a studio apartment 3 blocks from the ocean. She jogged every morning before work. She called her mother in Ohio every Sunday. On September 14, 1993, Catherine Wells left her apartment at 7:45 in the morning. She was wearing a white linen blouse and a turquoise skirt. She carried a leather portfolio under her arm. She smiled at her neighbor, an elderly man who was watering his hibiscus plants. She walked to the corner and waited for the bus. She never arrived at work. For 3 decades, her disappearance would be filed under missing person, presumed voluntary. The investigation lasted 6 weeks. The file was thin. The witnesses were few. The theories were vague and convenient. She had run away. She had started a new life somewhere else. She had wanted to disappear. But Catherine Wells had not wanted to disappear. Someone had made that choice for her. And that someone had been protected by the most powerful force in any small community. The decision, collective and unspoken, that certain truths are too dangerous to acknowledge. This is the story of how that silence was finally broken. How forensic science and the relentless passage of time conspired to reveal what a neighborhood had known, or suspected, or feared for 30 years. How an arrest in 2023 would send shockwaves through a community that had convinced itself the past was buried for good. The truth, it turns out, does not stay buried. It waits. It gathers evidence. It watches as the guilty grow old and careless. And when the moment comes, it speaks with a clarity that no amount of silence can suppress. This is the Miami Beach cold case that shocked a community. Not because of what happened, but because of who had known all along and said nothing. Catherine Marie Wells was born in Columbus, Ohio in 1965. She was the middle child of 3 daughters. Her father was an accountant. Her mother taught elementary school. The family was stable, affectionate, unremarkable in the best possible way. Catherine played clarinet in the high school band. She graduated with honors. She studied art history at Ohio State University. In 1991, she moved to Miami Beach. The decision surprised her family. Catherine had always been cautious, methodical, someone who planned her life in careful increments. But she had visited Miami Beach during spring break her senior year of college, and something about the light, the architecture, the sense of possibility had stayed with her. She found work at the Meridian Gallery, a small space on Lincoln Road that specialized in contemporary Latin American art. The owner, a Cuban émigré named Hector Ruiz, appreciated her knowledge and her quiet professionalism. She curated small exhibitions. She wrote catalog essays. She built relationships with collectors. She was good at her job. Lincoln Road in 1993 was not yet the pedestrian mall it would become. It was a street in transition, caught between its faded past and its uncertain future. Some storefronts were empty. Others housed struggling businesses. But there were signs of renewal. New galleries were opening. Cafes were appearing. Young people were moving into the neighborhood, drawn by cheap rent and the promise of something new. Catherine lived in a studio apartment on Euclid Avenue, a quiet residential street lined with small Art Deco buildings. Her apartment was on the 2nd floor. It had terrazzo floors and a small balcony that faced east toward the ocean. She furnished it simply: a futon, a bookshelf, a small table where she ate her meals and wrote letters home. She had a routine. She woke at 6 every morning. She jogged along the beach, north to 41st Street and back. She showered, dressed, ate a bowl of cereal. She caught the bus at 7:45. She arrived at the gallery by 8:15. She worked until 6. She went home, cooked dinner, read, went to bed by 10. She had friends, but not many. She dated occasionally, but nothing serious. She was friendly with her neighbors, but she kept her private life private. She was, by all accounts, a woman who had found a comfortable rhythm in a new city. She was content. Her mother, Linda Wells, would later describe her daughter as someone who bloomed slowly. Catherine was not impulsive. She did not take risks. She did not make enemies. She was kind, reliable, almost invisible in her normalcy, which is why her disappearance made no sense. On the morning of September 14, 1993, Catherine followed her routine exactly. She jogged, she showered. She dressed in her white linen blouse and turquoise skirt. She left her apartment at 7:45. Her neighbor, Ernesto Vega, saw her. He waved. She waved back. She walked to the corner of Euclid and 16th Street and waited for the bus. The bus arrived at 7:52. The driver, a man named Marcus Johnson, would later tell police he did not remember seeing Catherine board, but he drove that route 5 days a week, and he saw hundreds of faces. He could not be certain. Catherine did not arrive at the gallery. At 8:30, Hector Ruiz called her apartment. No answer. At 9, he called again. At 10, he began to worry. Catherine was never late. She never missed work without calling. At 11, he called the police. The initial response was muted. Adults go missing all the time. Most of them come back. The officer who took the report was polite but not particularly concerned. He asked the standard questions. Was she depressed? Was she in debt? Was she having relationship problems? Hector said no to all of it. The officer made a note and said they would look into it. But as the hours passed and Catherine did not return, the concern deepened. Her apartment was checked. Nothing was missing. Her clothes were in the closet. Her toothbrush was in the bathroom. Her purse was gone, but that made sense. She had taken it with her when she left. Her bank account showed no unusual activity. Her credit cards had not been used. It was as if she had simply stepped off the edge of the world. Miami Beach in 1993 was a city of contrasts. The tourist areas were bright and loud, full of music and color and motion. But the residential neighborhoods were quieter, more insular. People knew each other. They watched each other. They talked. And in those first few days after Catherine disappeared, people began to talk. Not loudly, not publicly. But in low voices, behind closed doors, they began to share what they had seen, or thought they had seen, or heard from someone else who claimed to have seen. A woman on Euclid Avenue said she had seen a car idling near the bus stop that morning. A dark sedan. She could not remember the make or model. She had not thought anything of it at the time. A man who worked at a convenience store 2 blocks away said a woman matching Catherine's description had come in around 8 that morning. She had bought a bottle of water. She had seemed nervous, but he could not be sure it was her. A teenager said he had seen a woman arguing with a man near the beach that morning. The woman had auburn hair. The man was older, maybe in his 50s. They had been standing near a parked car, but the teenager had been on his skateboard, moving fast, and he had not stopped to look closely. These fragments of information were reported to the police. They were written down. They were filed. But they did not cohere into a narrative. They were pieces of a puzzle that did not yet have a shape. And as the days turned into weeks, and Catherine did not return, the investigation began to lose momentum. There were no leads, no witnesses, no evidence of foul play, just a woman who had vanished on a Tuesday morning, leaving behind a life that seemed to everyone who knew her perfectly ordinary. The first 48 hours after a disappearance are critical. After that, the trail grows cold. Memories fade. Evidence degrades. The world moves on. By the 3rd day, the Miami Beach Police Department had assigned a detective to Catherine's case. His name was Robert Delgado. He was 42 years old, a 15-year veteran of the department. He had worked missing persons before. He knew the statistics. Most adults who go missing do so voluntarily. They leave bad relationships, bad debts, bad lives. They start over somewhere else. But Catherine Wells did not fit that profile. She had no debts, no enemies, no reason to run. Delgado knew that. And it troubled him. He began by retracing her last known movements. He spoke to Ernesto Vega, the neighbor who had seen her leave that morning. Vega was 73 years old, a retired postal worker. He had lived on Euclid Avenue for 30 years. He knew everyone on the block. Vega described Catherine as polite, quiet, always in a hurry. She jogged every morning. She smiled when she passed him. She never stopped to chat. On the morning of September 14th, she had been carrying her leather portfolio. She had been wearing a white blouse and a turquoise skirt. She had looked, Vega said, exactly as she always looked. Delgado spoke to the bus driver, Marcus Johnson. Johnson was apologetic but unhelpful. He drove the route every weekday. He saw dozens of people. He could not remember if Catherine had boarded that morning. He might have seen her, he might not have, he could not be sure. Delgado canvassed the neighborhood. He knocked on doors. He asked if anyone had seen anything unusual that morning. Most people said no. A few offered vague recollections. A car, a man, a woman who might have been Catherine. But nothing concrete. Nothing that could be verified. He spoke to Hector Ruiz at the gallery. Ruiz was distraught. Catherine had been a model employee. She had never been late. She had never missed a day of work. She had been excited about an upcoming exhibition. She had been planning to write an essay for the catalogue. She had no reason to disappear. Delgado asked if Catherine had mentioned any problems, any conflicts, any fears. Ruiz said no. She had been happy. She had been focused on her work. She had been, as far as he could tell, content with her life. Delgado spoke to Catherine's mother, Linda Wells, by phone. Linda was frantic. She had spoken to Catherine the previous Sunday. Catherine had sounded fine. She had talked about work, about a new restaurant she had tried, about a book she was reading. She had given no indication that anything was wrong. Linda flew to Miami Beach on the 4th day. She stayed in Catherine's apartment. She went through her daughter's belongings, looking for some clue, some explanation. She found nothing. Catherine's life, as preserved in that small studio, was orderly and unremarkable. There were no hidden letters, no secret diaries, no evidence of distress. By the end of the first week, Delgado had exhausted the obvious leads. He had interviewed everyone who knew Catherine. He had checked her phone records. He had reviewed her bank statements. He had found nothing that suggested foul play, and nothing that suggested she had left voluntarily. He was left with a mystery. A woman had vanished in broad daylight, on a busy street, in a neighborhood where people knew each other. And no one had seen anything. No one knew anything. Or if they did, they were not saying. Delgado began to suspect the latter. There was something in the way people spoke to him, a hesitation, a careful choice of words, a reluctance to speculate. It was subtle, but it was there. People were holding back, not lying exactly, but not telling the whole truth either. He pressed harder. He re-interviewed witnesses. He asked more pointed questions. He made it clear that he was not going away. And slowly, reluctantly, people began to talk. The woman who had seen the dark sedan near the bus stop admitted that she had seen the car before. It belonged to someone in the neighborhood. She did not know who. But she had seen it parked on Euclid Avenue several times in the weeks before Catherine disappeared. The man at the convenience store remembered something else. The woman who had bought the bottle of water had been followed into the store by a man. An older man. The man had not bought anything. He had just stood near the door watching. The clerk had thought it was strange at the time, but he had not said anything. The teenager who had seen the argument near the beach admitted that he had recognized the man. He lived in the neighborhood. He was someone people knew, but the teenager would not give a name. He said his parents had told him not to get involved. Delgado felt the case shifting. There was something here, something people knew but were afraid to say. He pushed harder. He made it clear that withholding information in a missing persons case was serious. That Catherine's life might depend on what people were willing to share. But the more he pushed, the more the neighborhood closed ranks. People stopped answering their doors. Phone calls went unreturned. Witnesses changed their stories, claiming they had been mistaken, that they had not seen anything after all. Delgado knew what was happening. Someone in the neighborhood was involved. And the community, consciously or not, had decided to protect that person. Not out of malice, but out of fear, or loyalty, or the simple human instinct to avoid trouble. By the end of the third week, the investigation had stalled. Delgado had no physical evidence, no credible witnesses, no leads. Just a growing certainty that Catherine Wells had not left voluntarily, that something terrible had happened to her, and that people knew more than they were saying. He wrote a detailed report. He recommended that the case remain open. He requested additional resources. But Miami Beach in 1993 was a busy place. There were other crimes, other priorities. The department had limited resources. And without evidence, without witnesses, there was only so much they could do. Catherine's case was filed as a missing person. Her photograph was circulated. Her description was entered into national databases. Her family hired a private investigator. Flyers were posted. Rewards were offered. But as the weeks turned into months and no new information emerged, the case grew cold. Catherine Wells became another name in a file, another unsolved mystery. Another woman who had vanished without a trace, and the neighborhood slowly, carefully returned to normal. People stopped talking about Catherine. They stopped speculating. They went back to their routines. The silence, once broken, was restored. But silence, as it turns out, is not the same as forgetting. And secrets, no matter how carefully kept, have a way of surfacing when the time is right. Detective Robert Delgado did not give up easily. Even as the case grew cold, even as the department moved on to other priorities, he continued to work Catherine's disappearance in whatever spare time he could find. He returned to the neighborhood again and again. He knocked on doors. He asked the same questions in different ways. He watched, he listened. He waited for someone to slip, to say something they had not meant to say. He focused on the dark sedan. Multiple witnesses had mentioned it. It had been seen near the bus stop on the morning Catherine disappeared. It had been seen on Euclid Avenue in the weeks before. Someone in the neighborhood owned that car. Delgado was certain of it. He began compiling a list. He checked vehicle registrations for every resident within a 6-block radius of Catherine's apartment. He cross-referenced the list with witness descriptions: dark sedan, older model, American make, possibly a Buick or an Oldsmobile. He found 3 possible matches. One belonged to a retired schoolteacher who had not driven in years. The car sat in her driveway, covered in dust. Another belonged to a young couple who had moved to the neighborhood only 2 months before Catherine disappeared. They had alibis for the morning in question. The third car belonged to a man named Thomas Brennan. He was 56 years old. He had lived on Euclid Avenue for 12 years. He worked as a building superintendent for a small apartment complex 2 blocks from Catherine's building. He was quiet, unremarkable, the kind of person who blended into the background. Delgado interviewed Brennan on October 8, 1993. Brennan was cooperative. He said he had heard about the missing woman. He said he hoped she would be found safe. He said he had not seen anything unusual on the morning of September 14th. Delgado asked about the car. Brennan confirmed that he owned a dark blue 1987 Oldsmobile Cutlass. He said he drove it to work every day. He parked it in the lot behind the apartment complex where he worked. He had not been near the bus stop on Euclid Avenue that morning. Delgado asked if anyone could verify that. Brennan said the building manager could confirm he had been at work by 8 that morning. Delgado checked. The manager confirmed it. Brennan had clocked in at 7:55. It seemed like a dead end. But something about the interview bothered Delgado. Brennan had been too calm, too cooperative, too ready with answers. There was no nervousness, no curiosity, no emotion. Just a flat, rehearsed quality to his responses. Delgado ran a background check. Brennan had no criminal record, no history of violence, no red flags. He had been married once in the early 1980s. The marriage had ended in divorce. He had no children. He lived alone in a small house on Euclid Avenue, 3 doors down from Catherine's apartment. Delgado spoke to Brennan's neighbors. They described him as quiet, solitary, polite, but distant. He kept to himself. He did not socialize. He did not cause trouble. He was, in the words of one neighbor, the kind of person you forget is there. But one neighbor, an elderly woman named Rose Martinez, said something that caught Delgado's attention. She said Brennan used to watch people. He would sit on his porch in the evenings smoking cigarettes, watching the street. He never spoke to anyone, he just watched. Delgado asked if Brennan had ever watched Catherine. Rose hesitated. Then she said yes. She had seen him watching Catherine when she jogged in the mornings. She had thought it was strange, but she had not said anything. It was not her business. Delgado felt the case shift again. He returned to Brennan's house. He asked if he could search the property. Brennan refused. He said he had nothing to hide, but he did not want police going through his belongings. He knew his rights. Delgado could not force the issue. He had no warrant, no probable cause. Just a suspicion. He left, but he did not give up. He began surveillance. He watched Brennan's house. He followed Brennan to work. He looked for any sign of unusual behavior. He found nothing. Brennan went to work. He came home. He sat on his porch. He smoked. He watched the street. He was careful, methodical. He did nothing that could be construed as suspicious. Delgado knew he was being watched in return. Brennan knew the police were interested in him, and he was being careful. Too careful. Delgado tried a different approach. He spoke to Brennan's ex-wife. She lived in Fort Lauderdale. She agreed to meet him. She said the marriage had ended because Brennan was controlling. He had wanted to know where she was at all times. He had monitored her phone calls. He had followed her when she went out. She had felt suffocated. She had left. Delgado asked if Brennan had ever been violent. She said no. He had never hit her. He had never threatened her. But there had been something in the way he looked at her, something cold, something that made her afraid. It was not enough. Delgado knew it. He had a theory. He had a suspect. But he had no evidence, no physical proof, no witnesses willing to testify, just a collection of suspicions and half-remembered observations. He presented his findings to his superiors. He argued that Brennan should be considered a person of interest, that the case should remain active, that resources should be allocated to continue the investigation, but the department was stretched thin. There were other cases, other priorities, and without evidence, there was nothing they could do. Brennan had not been charged. He had not been arrested. He had cooperated with the investigation. There was no legal basis to continue surveillance. Delgado was told to move on. The case would remain open, but it would no longer be actively investigated. If new evidence emerged, it would be pursued. But for now, there was nothing more to be done. Delgado filed his final report in December 1993. He wrote that he believed Catherine Wells had been abducted, that she had likely been killed. That Thomas Brennan was the most likely suspect, but he acknowledged that he had no proof, just a theory, just a suspicion. The file was closed, not officially, but in practice. Catherine Wells became another cold case, another unsolved mystery, another name in a database. And Thomas Brennan continued to live on Euclid Avenue. He continued to work as a building superintendent. He continued to sit on his porch in the evenings, smoking cigarettes, watching the street. And the neighborhood once again fell silent. Time has a way of eroding certainty. What seemed urgent in 1993 became distant by 1995. By 2000, Catherine Wells was a name that most people in the neighborhood no longer remembered. New residents moved in. Old residents moved away. The Art Deco buildings were renovated. Lincoln Road became a pedestrian mall. Miami Beach transformed itself into a destination. Detective Robert Delgado retired in 2004. He had spent 11 years thinking about Catherine Wells. He had never stopped believing that Thomas Brennan was responsible for her disappearance, but he had never been able to prove it. The case haunted him. It was the one that got away. Before he left the department, he made sure the file was preserved. He wrote a detailed memo outlining his suspicions. He included every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every observation. He wanted to make sure that if new information ever emerged, the next detective would know where to look. Thomas Brennan continued to live on Euclid Avenue. He aged quietly. His hair turned gray. His face grew lined. He moved more slowly. But he remained in the neighborhood, a fixture, a ghost of the past that no one quite remembered. In 2008, he retired from his job as a building superintendent. He spent his days at home. He still sat on his porch in the evenings. He still watched the street, but there were fewer people to watch. The neighborhood had changed. It was wealthier now, younger. The old residents were gone. Catherine's mother, Linda Wells, never stopped searching. She hired private investigators. She contacted psychics. She posted on missing persons websites. She kept her daughter's case alive in the only way she knew how, by refusing to forget. In 2015, she published a small book about Catherine's disappearance. It was self-published, poorly distributed, read by almost no one. But it existed. It was a record, a testament, a refusal to let silence be the final word. Linda died in 2019. She was 78 years old. She had spent 26 years looking for her daughter. She had never found her. She had never learned what happened. She died not knowing, but the case did not die with her. It remained in the files. It remained in the databases. And in 2021, something changed. The Miami Beach Police Department received a grant to review cold cases using new forensic technology. DNA analysis had advanced significantly since 1993. Genetic genealogy had become a powerful tool. Cases that had seemed unsolvable were being reopened and resolved. A new detective, Maria Santos, was assigned to review the cold cases from the 1990s. She was 34 years old, ambitious, thorough. She had heard about the Catherine Wells case. She had read Delgado's memo. She was intrigued. She began by re-examining the physical evidence. There was not much. Catherine's apartment had been searched in 1993, but nothing had been taken for forensic analysis. There had been no crime scene. No body, no blood, no DNA. But Santos was persistent. She went back to the original case file. She found a note that Delgado had made. A witness had reported seeing a woman's scarf near the beach, about a mile north of Catherine's apartment, 2 days after she disappeared. The scarf had been collected as potential evidence. It had been logged. It had been stored. Santos requested the evidence. It took 3 weeks to locate it. The scarf had been in storage for 28 years. It was in a sealed plastic bag, labeled and dated. It was turquoise, the same color as the skirt Catherine had been wearing the day she disappeared. Santos sent the scarf to the lab. She requested DNA analysis. She requested touch DNA analysis, a technique that had not existed in 1993. Touch DNA can recover genetic material from skin cells left on fabric. The results came back in March 2022. There were 2 DNA profiles on the scarf. One was consistent with Catherine Wells. The lab had used DNA from a hairbrush that Linda Wells had preserved. The match was definitive. The second profile was male. It was unknown. It was not in any database, but it was there. It was evidence. It was proof that someone had touched that scarf, someone who had been in contact with Catherine. Santos knew what she had to do. She needed a DNA sample from Thomas Brennan. But Brennan was 85 years old. He was frail. He rarely left his house, and she could not compel him to provide a sample without probable cause. She needed another approach. She began researching genetic genealogy. She uploaded the unknown DNA profile to a public genealogy database. She waited. In August 2022, she got a hit. The DNA matched a distant relative of Thomas Brennan, a second cousin. The connection was distant, but it was enough. Santos built a family tree. She traced the lineage. She confirmed the connection. She now had probable cause. She obtained a warrant. On September 12, 2022, she knocked on Thomas Brennan's door. She explained that she was investigating a cold case. She asked if he would voluntarily provide a DNA sample. He refused. She presented the warrant. She collected a buccal swab. She sent it to the lab. She waited. The results came back in November 2022. The DNA from Thomas Brennan was a match to the unknown profile on the scarf. The probability of a random match was 1 in several trillion. Thomas Brennan had touched Catherine Wells's scarf. He had been in contact with her, and he had lied about it for 29 years. The arrest warrant was issued on January 10, 2023. Detective Maria Santos assembled a team. She briefed them on the case. She explained the evidence. She made it clear that Thomas Brennan was 86 years old, frail, and unlikely to resist, but she also made it clear that he was dangerous. That he had gotten away with murder for 30 years, that he was not to be underestimated. On January 12, 2023, at 6 in the morning, Santos and 4 uniformed officers arrived at Brennan's house on Euclid Avenue. The street was quiet. The sun was just beginning to rise. The air was cool and damp. Santos knocked on the door. There was no answer. She knocked again. She announced herself. She said she had a warrant. She said the door would be forced if necessary. After a long moment, the door opened. Thomas Brennan stood in the doorway. He was thin, stooped, his face deeply lined. He looked at Santos with pale, watery eyes. He did not seem surprised. Santos read him his rights. She told him he was under arrest for the abduction and murder of Catherine Wells. She told him he had the right to remain silent. He said nothing. He did not resist. He allowed himself to be handcuffed. He walked slowly to the patrol car. As he was being led away, neighbors began to emerge from their houses. They stood on their porches watching. Some of them had lived on Euclid Avenue for decades. Some of them had known Thomas Brennan. Some of them had known Catherine Wells. They watched in silence as Brennan was placed in the back of the patrol car. They watched as the car pulled away, and then slowly they went back inside. The arrest made headlines. Miami Beach cold case solved after 30 years. DNA evidence leads to arrest in 1993 disappearance. Neighbor charged in decades-old murder. The community was shocked, not because they had not suspected, but because the suspicion had been buried so deeply, for so long, that it had become part of the landscape. Something everyone knew but no one acknowledged. Detective Santos held a press conference. She explained the evidence. She described the DNA match. She thanked the forensic team. She thanked the witnesses who had come forward in 1993, even though their information had not been enough at the time. She did not mention the silence. She did not mention the way the neighborhood had closed ranks. She did not mention the years that had been lost because people had been afraid to speak. But the silence was there, in the room, unspoken but understood. Thomas Brennan was held without bail. His arraignment was scheduled for February. His public defender entered a plea of not guilty. But the evidence was overwhelming. The DNA was definitive. The case was strong. In March 2023, Brennan's attorney approached the prosecution with a deal. Brennan would plead guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a sentence of 25 years to life. He would provide information about what had happened to Catherine. He would tell them where her body was. The prosecution agreed. On April 5, 2023, Thomas Brennan stood in a Miami courtroom and admitted that he had killed Catherine Wells. He said he had followed her that morning. He said he had offered her a ride. He said she had refused. He said he had forced her into his car. He said he had driven her to a remote area west of the city. He said he had killed her there. He said he had buried her body in a shallow grave in the Everglades. He did not explain why. He did not express remorse. He simply stated the facts in a flat, emotionless voice, as if he were describing something that had happened to someone else. A search team was dispatched to the location Brennan had described. It took 3 days. But on April 8th they found her, Catherine Wells, what remained of her. 30 years in the ground, bones and fragments of clothing, a turquoise skirt, a white blouse. She was identified through dental records. Her remains were released to her family. There was no family left. Linda Wells had died 4 years earlier. Catherine's sisters arranged for a small funeral. She was buried in Ohio next to her mother. Thomas Brennan was sentenced on May 15, 2023. He received 25 years to life. At 86 years old, it was a life sentence. He would die in prison. The judge, in her remarks, spoke about justice delayed. She spoke about the importance of never giving up. She spoke about the power of science to reveal truth. She did not speak about the silence. She did not speak about the community that had known or suspected and said nothing. But the silence was there. It hung over the courtroom like a weight. Detective Maria Santos closed the case file. She had solved a 30-year-old murder. She had brought a killer to justice. She had given Catherine Wells's family closure. even if that family no longer existed. But she knew the truth. The case had not been unsolvable. It had been solvable in 1993. If people had spoken. If witnesses had been willing to testify. If the community had chosen truth over silence. Catherine Wells had died because one man had decided to kill her. But she had remained missing for 30 years because a community had decided, consciously or not, that some truths were too uncomfortable to face. The silence had protected Thomas Brennan. And the silence had condemned Catherine Wells to 3 decades in an unmarked grave. The courtroom emptied slowly after the sentencing. Reporters filed out first, rushing to meet deadlines. Then the lawyers gathering their files, exchanging brief professional courtesies. Then the spectators, the curious, the people who had come to witness the end of a story that had haunted Miami Beach for 3 decades. Detective Maria Santos remained in her seat. She watched as Thomas Brennan was led away in handcuffs, his shoulders hunched, his steps shuffling. He did not look back. He did not acknowledge anyone. He simply disappeared through the door that led to the holding cells, and then he was gone. Santos thought about Catherine Wells, about the woman in the photographs she had studied for months, the woman with auburn hair and a warm smile, the woman who had jogged every morning along the beach, the woman who had called her mother every Sunday, the woman who had simply wanted to build a life in a new city. She thought about the 30 years Catherine had spent in the ground. 30 years while the world moved on, while Miami Beach transformed itself, while the people who had known her, or known of her, grew older and forgot. She thought about Linda Wells, who had died without knowing what had happened to her daughter, who had spent 26 years searching, hoping, refusing to give up, who had published a book that almost no one read, who had kept the case alive through sheer force of will. Santos had read that book. It was poorly written, repetitive, filled with speculation and grief, but it had contained something important, a list of names, people Linda Wells had spoken to over the years, people who had lived on Euclid Avenue in 1993, people who had seen things, heard things, suspected things. Santos had tracked down as many of those people as she could. Some had moved away, some had died, but a few remained. And when she spoke to them, after the arrest, after the DNA evidence had made denial impossible, they had finally talked. Rose Martinez, the elderly woman who had told Detective Delgado in 1993 that Brennan used to watch Catherine, was still alive. She was 94 years old, living in a nursing home in Coral Gables. Santos visited her in June 2023. Rose remembered everything. She said she had known from the moment Catherine disappeared that Brennan was involved. She had seen him watching Catherine for months. She had seen his car near the bus stop that morning. She had seen him return home later that day, agitated, washing his car in the driveway. Santos asked why she had not said more at the time. Rose looked away. She said she had been afraid. Brennan had lived 3 doors down. She had been an old woman living alone. She had not wanted trouble. She had told herself it was not her business. She said she had regretted it every day since. Santos spoke to others, a man who had been a teenager in 1993, who had seen Brennan and Catherine arguing near the beach. He said he had recognized Brennan immediately, but his parents had told him not to get involved. They had said the police would handle it. They had said it was not their concern. He said he had thought about Catherine Wells often over the years. He said he had wondered if speaking up would have made a difference. He said he would never know. Santos spoke to a woman who had worked at the convenience store near Catherine's apartment. She said a man matching Brennan's description had come in several times in the weeks before Catherine disappeared. He had never bought anything. He had just stood near the window watching the street. She had thought it was strange, but she had not reported it. She said she had not wanted to cause trouble. She said she had not been sure it meant anything. She said she had convinced herself it was nothing. The pattern was clear. People had seen, people had known, but they had chosen silence, not out of malice, not out of conspiracy, but out of fear, out of convenience, out of the simple human desire to avoid conflict. And that silence had allowed Thomas Brennan to walk free for 30 years. In July 2023, Santos was invited to speak at a conference on cold case investigations. She presented the Catherine Wells case as an example of how modern forensic technology could solve decades-old crimes. She described the DNA evidence, the genetic genealogy, the painstaking work of building a family tree from a distant cousin's profile. But in the question and answer session, someone asked a different question. They asked why the case had remained unsolved for so long. They asked if it could have been solved earlier. Santos paused. She thought about the file she had read, about Delgado's memo, about the witnesses who had seen but not spoken, about the community that had closed ranks. She said yes. She said the case could have been solved in 1993. She said the evidence had been there. The witnesses had been there. But the will to pursue the truth had been lacking. Not in the police department, but in the community. She said that silence was as much an obstacle to justice as any lack of evidence, that when people chose not to speak, they became complicit. Not legally, but morally. The room was quiet when she finished. No one asked another question. In August 2023, the Miami Beach Police Department held a small ceremony to honor Detective Robert Delgado. He had died in 2019, 5 years before the case was solved. But his work had been instrumental. His memo had guided Santos. His suspicions had been correct. His persistence had kept the case alive. His widow attended the ceremony. She was given a commendation on his behalf. She said her husband had never stopped thinking about Catherine Wells. She said he had believed, until the day he died, that Thomas Brennan was responsible. She said he would have been gratified to know he was right. Santos thought about that. About being right but never knowing it. About working a case for years and never seeing it resolved. About the frustration, the doubt, the sense of failure. She thought about how many cases like that existed. How many detectives had worked unsolved murders, had suspected the right person, had been unable to prove it. How many families had died without answers. How many victims had remained in unmarked graves. She thought about how fragile justice was. How dependent on timing, on technology, on the willingness of people to speak. In September 2023, on the 30th anniversary of Catherine Wells's disappearance, a small memorial was held on Euclid Avenue. It was organized by a neighborhood association, most of whose members had not lived there in 1993. They planted a tree in Catherine's memory. They placed a plaque with her name and dates. A few of the old residents attended. Rose Martinez was there in a wheelchair, accompanied by a nurse. The man who had been a teenager in 1993 was there, now in his 40s with his own children. The woman from the convenience store was there, grey-haired and quiet. They stood in silence as the plaque was unveiled. They listened as someone read a brief biography of Catherine. They watched as the tree was planted, and then, one by one, they spoke. They said they were sorry. They said they wished they had done more. They said they had carried the weight of their silence for 30 years. It was not absolution, it was not redemption, but it was acknowledgement. It was the breaking of a silence that had lasted 3 decades. Santos attended the ceremony. She stood at the back, watching. She thought about Catherine Wells, about the life she had lived and the life she had been denied. About the 30 years she had spent in the ground while the world moved on. She thought about Thomas Brennan, sitting in a prison cell, 86 years old, waiting to die. She wondered if he thought about Catherine, if he felt remorse, if he understood what he had taken. She doubted it. Men like Brennan rarely did. But the case was closed. The truth had been revealed. Catherine Wells had been found. Her killer had been brought to justice. It was not perfect. It was not complete. But it was something. Justice, Santos had learned, was rarely perfect. It was often delayed. It was often incomplete. But it was better than silence. It was better than forgetting. Catherine Wells had not been forgotten. Her name was on a plaque. Her story had been told. Her killer had been held accountable. It was not enough. It would never be enough, but it was what justice looked like, 30 years late. The memorial ended. People dispersed. The street returned to normal. Life went on as it always does, but the tree remained, and the plaque remained, and the story remained, a reminder that silence has a cost, that truth, no matter how long delayed, matters. that every victim deserves to be remembered. That every case, no matter how cold, deserves to be pursued. Catherine Wells had disappeared on a Tuesday morning in September 1993. She had been found in April 2023, 30 years, 6 months, and 24 days later. The silence had been broken. The truth had been told, and Catherine Wells at last could rest.